So this is what happens. I got myself going, so I have to tell the last of the children's jokes. So a teacher is teaching the catechism to the children and covering the 10 Commandments. And says, now, children, recognize the fourth commandment after those about our Lord says, honor thy father and thy mother. So it's very important that you honor your father and your mother at all times. And Susie raises her hand and says, why isn't there one about our brothers and sisters? And Johnny says, oh, there is. Teacher says, well, which one is that? And Johnny says, thou shalt not kill. So,
there's the one, Dr. Interrupt, there's the other one which some of you may know, but it doesn't matter. Not all of you will have heard it. There's the class where the mistress is telling them what martyrdom is, and she says that now, children, if you're martyrs, you will go straight to heaven without having to go through purgatory, without having to wait. No, go straight to heaven. Now, do we all want to be martyrs? Hands shoot up all over the place. But little Johnny, Johnny, don't you want to be a martyr? I want my sister to be a martyr.
Oh, that's good. Oh, see, now he's got me started. So it's a public, as we say, public school. Here would be a private school. It's reversed here. And the modern science teacher is teaching the children and slipping in anti-Christian notions. And so she's saying, so now that we've studied about the whale, you know that the whale's throat is very small and a whale could not swallow a man. Well, Johnny raises his hand and says, what about Jonah? He was swallowed by a whale. I just told you, we have just in our science course learned that the whale's throat is very small and a whale cannot swallow a man, so it could not have happened. And Johnny says, oh, well, when I get to heaven, I'll ask Jonah about it. And the teacher says, well, and what happens if Jonah isn't in heaven? He says, what if he's in the other place? Johnny says, well, then you can ask him. As the old comedy routine used to have it, stick around for the jokes. They're not. Can I tell the one I told last night? I think I can. See, it never stops. Because, well, talking about thisness, God makes you in one way, and you are who you are. So a woman goes to her doctor and is told that she has a very severe disease and has to have surgery at once. She's terrified. And she goes home and, not being religious, she gets down, prays for the first time in ages and says, oh God, please, please let me be healthy again. Let me survive this surgery. Let me know if I'm going to live. And a voice from above says, you will survive the surgery. You have 10 more years to live. Thank you, God. She goes in the hospital. She has the surgery. The doctors say, you're fully recovered. It's a miracle. You'll have a long life. She says, oh, well, that's great. Since I'm here. So she has a facelift, and she has her breasts enhanced, and she has her tummy tucked, and she has her bottoms raised, and she's feeling just wonderful. And she walks out of the hospital and is crossing the street and is hit by a truck and killed instantly. And she stands before God and says, God, you told me I had 10 more years. And God says, I didn't recognize you. Well, anyway, I was going to read this back when when I did the Felix Randall poem about death. This is from one of Hopkins' sermons. And again, it's what you get a sense of. He might not have thought he did good sermons, but they really are very fine. They're very orthodox. Do not believe hell is merely a myth, for just as shutting your eyes will not do away with a steeple or a signpost, so not believing in hell does not put it out of being. How many go on living in mortal sin who, if they died suddenly, must die in mortal sin? God has provided us with the last sacraments, the grace of contrition, and holy hope. Even if it is too late for that, if there is sorrow for sin, for this sorrow, plead for it, with inward tears at least, and with hope. Your last strength, save for that, because God knows our need. Still, the better you serve God, the better and more special will be his providence over your death. For as you live, so will you die. I think of certain recent popes. Well, there may be a hell, but if there is, it's empty. Or someone else saying, well, there isn't really hell. The evil people just sort of disappear. That's all over. What can you say? Because of the terrible conditions in Dublin, this poor, weak man who had never been healthy became constantly sick. During the 5 years he was there, he was in almost constant, at least discomfort, one sickness after another. So that when he came down with typhus and was hospitalized, no one thought it was particularly serious. I mean, they cared for him, but just assumed Hopkins is sick again, and he seems to be very sick this time. But the good priest would visit him, and he would rally, and they'd say, well, you'll be out of here soon, and not realizing he was desperately ill. And when suddenly he took an unexpected turn for the worse, and it became clear he wasn't going to make it, they wrote his parents, who came at once. He was given the last sacraments, and his parents came and were at his bedside when their son died. And his last conscious words were, I am so happy. I am so happy. And he left the world. Just remarkable. Another comment he made about his writings, and I think this is good. In some meditation today, I earnestly asked our Lord to watch over my compositions, not to preserve them from being lost or coming to nothing. For that I am very willing they should be, but that they might do me no harm through the enmity or imprudence of any man or my own, that he should have them as his own and employ or not employ them as he would see fit. And that, I believe, is heard. And indeed, as I said, it was in 1918, his friend Robert Bridges, who was then poet laureate, gathered the poems and published them for the very first time. Small number of copies, only 750 were printed at the time. They didn't sell well, but if you had one of those copies today, it would be worth a small fortune. And his reputation grew and grew, and far from being unread and dismissed, he really is now recognized as one of the very greatest poets that England produced in the modern age. Although there are only 49 major poems, and as I said, when he went to his death, not one had been published or was known. So in terms of his poetry, not that he thought himself a failure, put the poems in the hands of God to do with them as he wished, and God waited until the horrors of World War I to let them loose into the world. And I do think there are many ways in which he speaks to those of us today who are in a situation even worse as the world gets worse and worse, and especially during those times when we look at the church or look at our own lives or see the misery about us, that especially those last sonnets, poets speak for us and say things that we are unable to say for ourselves, whether in times of great joy And then we turn to them and quote poetry that is appropriate for the moment, or moments of sorrow and loss when we have them speak to us, or in this case, just the sheer pain often of trying to be a Catholic and holding to the faith during times that seem very dark indeed. I think God in his wisdom saved the poems and gave them to us at this time. Let me, just a couple of the last ones. This is, find it here. This isn't one of the sonnets of desolation by any means. But it's a call for some assistance. The little title he puts on it is in Latin, "Thou art indeed just, God." Okay, it's from Jeremiah. "Thou art indeed just, Lord, if I contend with thee. But, sir, so what I plead is just. Why do sinners' ways prosper? And why must disappointment all I endeavor end? Wert thou my enemy, O thou my friend, how wouldst thou worse, I wonder, than thou dost defeat, thwart me? Oh, the sots and thralls of lust do in spare hours more thrive than I that spend, sir, life upon thy cause. See, banks and brakes now, leavid how thick, laced they are again with fretty chervel. Look, and the fresh wind shakes them. Birds build, but not I build. No, but strain, time's eunuch, and not breed one work that wakes. Mine, O thou Lord of life, send my roots rain." It's just a lovely poem, absolutely lovely poem. And yeah, it seems to me pretty clear that was the answer. He said at one point, this is nice, "The only just judge, the only just literary critic is Christ, who prizes, is proud of, and admires, more than any man, more than the receiver himself can, the gifts of his own making." For all of those critics that are out there, all those university professors making pronouncements, Christ is the ultimate literary critic. My own teacher in my undergraduate days, John Berryman, who was hugely influenced by Hopkins, who had been raised Catholic but abandoned the faith when his father committed suicide in front of him. He has one of his poems that begins, "My father's suicide blew out my bright candle of faith," and fought his entire life trying to deal with suicide and the complications leading to a dissolute life, terrible business with women and alcohol, and sent into the mental wards and falling over and over. And when he tried to come back to the church, found the Novus Ordo and was absolutely bowled over by what was going on there. And then, that first Sunday he was there, the Novus Ordo priest stood up in the altar and began lecturing, in the pulpit, and began lecturing the Catholics there about they demand too much of their priests, and they've got to realize that their priests have lives as well, and this nonsense that they should be led around like sheep, and that expecting the priest to be a shepherd to them when they can't be in charge of everybody and watch over everyone's life and take more control of your own life, you sheep. Berryman stood up in the pew where he was and screamed, "Only Christ's words!" and stomped out, and spent the rest of the time for the Mass walking back and forth outside the church, weeping and praying the rosary for the soul of the priest. One of his 11 addresses to the Lord ends with him quoting Hopkins, saying, the last line is, Father Hopkins says the only true literary critic is Christ. Let me lie down content with that. The sad thing is he lost it at the end, and as so often happens with children of suicides, he himself ultimately committed suicide, threw himself off a high bridge that goes across the Mississippi River at the University of Minnesota. Early one morning, went in, left a note at home with his wife saying, I'm going to the university, I have something to clear up. And 6:30 in the morning, hopped up on the rail. There was a worker coming to work at the student union who saw him, and Berryman smiled and waved at him and threw himself off. I pray he asked for forgiveness, because it was a long way down. But he's buried there. When I go to Minneapolis, it took me a long while to find his grave. I was able to pray a rosary at his grave, and we'll be visiting Dublin. And the irony, of course, is that Hopkins, who was so English and loved England, wound up buried in Dublin. So I feel the least I can do is find the graveyard and go to his grave and pray a rosary for him, and hope he'll be praying for all of us. It's a remarkable, remarkable story. Let me turn to this. This is, as they say, this is very upbeat, and we can have some of this. His devotion to Mary was intense. He calls this poem the May Magnificat. May is Mary's month, and I muse at that and wonder why. Her feasts follow reason, dated due to season. Candlemas, Lady Day, but the Lady month, May. Why fasten that upon her with a feasting in her honor? Is it only its being brighter than the most are must delight her? Is it opportunist and flowers finds soonest? Ask of her, the mighty mother. Her reply puts this other question: what is spring? Growth in everything. Flesh and fleece, fur and feather, grass and green world all together. Star-eyed, strawberry-breasted throstle, above her nested cluster of bugle-blue eggs thin, forms and warms the life within, and bird and blossom swell in sod or sheath or shell. All things rising, all things sizing Mary sees, sympathizing with that world of good, nature's motherhood. Their magnifying of each its kind with delight calls to mind how she did in her stored magnify the Lord. Well, but there was more than this. Spring's universal bliss had much to say to offering Mary May. When drop of blood and foam dapple, bloom lights the orchard apple, and thicket and thorpe are merry with silver surfed cherry, and azuring over graybell makes woodbanks and brakes wash wet like lakes, and magic cuckoo call caps, clears, and clinches all, this ecstasy all through mothering earth tells Mary her mirth till Christ's birth to remember, and exultation in God who was her salvation. Isn't that beautiful? It's just a beautiful poem. Yeah, it's called the May Magnificat. Again, as I say, one reason to get the collected poems, some are very hard, others are just simply lovely. You'll have no trouble reading them at all, and maybe you can begin to get familiar with some of them at this point. Let me do this. I'm going to read one of the last major poem he wrote. Not terribly long. I don't understand 9/10 of it. It is so hard. I've been wrestling with it for some weeks now, and I haven't cracked it yet. All I know is it's my inadequacy, and there is a lot going on in it. it is so rich and so thick, but I also know with all the greatest artists, their final works are tough. For many years, the last 4 Shakespeare plays, which are now highly honored and I think among his greatest works, were considered total catastrophes, and many critics said he had gone senile and had no idea what he was even writing. It's nonsense. There were people who said the late Beethoven string quartets were so odd because the deafness had gotten so bad and he'd forgotten to hear what music sounded like. It just happens over and over again. So as I say, I think the inadequacy here is fully mine. So the advice that I gave, I'm going to keep taking, and I'm going to wrestle with this talk. It's only about 25 lines, so it's not that long. But my goodness, it's a tough poem. The title of it is that nature is a Heraclitean fire and of the comfort of the resurrection. Hopkins had been reading the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who took the stance, and it was believed for a long, long time, that everything is made up of 4 elements: earth, air, water, and fire. Heraclitus made the claim that fire was the greatest of all the elements because it would consume everything else and it would be the final element. In a curious way, we know that at the end it's fire that's going to take up everything. So there might have been some intuition in him. But he also points out, Heraclitus points out, that everything can be consumed by fire, and for him it's a mark of the transitory nature of everything changing, everything coming to naught. Nothing exists in the world but what can be ultimately consumed by fire and burned away. So Hopkins is meditating on that and then changes his tune again. It's in a way that way is structured like the leaden echo and the golden echo. There's suddenly a shift in the poem, an abrupt shift in the poem. And again, you'll hear it. But I'll tell you this first part. I'll read it to you, but enjoy the words. They're quite astonishing. I wish I could figure out what was going on. But I'm no Hopkins. That nature is a Heraclitean fire and of the comfort of the resurrection. Begins with a vision of clouds going across the sky. Cloud puffball, torn tufts, tossed pillows, flaunt forth. They chevy on an air-built thoroughfare. Heaven roisterers, in gay gangs they throng, they glitter in marches. Down rough cast, down dazzling whitewash, wherever an elm arches, shive lights and shadow tackle in long lashes, lace, lance, and pear. Delightfully the bright wind boisterous, ropes, wrestles, beats earth bare of yester tempest's creases. In pool and rut peel parches, squandering ooze to squeezed dough, crust, dust, stenches, starches, squadroned masks and man-marks, treadmire toil there, foot-fretted in it. Million-fueled, nature's bonfire burns on, but quench her bonniest, dearest to her, her clearest selved spark, man, how fast his fire dint, his mark on mind is gone. Both are in an unfathomable, all is in an enormous dark, drowned. O pity and indignation, man-shape that shone sheer off, disseveral, a star, death blots black out, nor mark is any of him at all so stark, but vastness blurs and time beats level. Enough! The resurrection, a heart's clarion, away grief's gasping, joyless days, dejection. Across my foundering deck shone a beacon, an eternal beam. Flesh fade and mortal trash fall to the residuary worm. World's wildfire leave but ash. In a flash, at a trumpet crash, I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am. And this, Jack, joke, poor potsherd, patch, matchwood, immortal diamond, is immortal diamond. There's that ringing at the end. But of course, the diamond itself is made from that dark crushed material that the more it's crushed, eventually becomes the precious jewel. As I said, Hopkins is buried in Dublin, but they do have a memorial for him in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Gives his name, his dates, and on it simply says Immortal Diamond. So he wrote his own epitaph in a way. Read him. He's worth the time. Now, one last thing, and I decided to do this on the spur of the moment. Another poet, well, mathematician, poet, logician, writer, writing at the same time. Another glory of English poetry. Somewhat different. And just as in the old days, when the Greeks had presented their three tragedies, they had to follow it with a comic afterpiece. Let's lighten things up a bit here. And I may botch this because it's been a while, so be patient. The old mind isn't what it used to be. This is by Lewis Carroll, written almost at the same time that Hopkins was writing. It's called The Walrus and the Carpenter. The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did the very best to make the billows smooth and bright, and this was odd because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. It's very rude of him, she said, to come and spoil our fun. The seas were wet as wet can be. The sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud because no clouds were in the sky. No birds were flying overhead. There were no birds to fly. The walrus and the carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If only it were swept away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you think, the walrus said, that they could make it clear? I doubt it, said the carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oh, oysters, come and walk with us, the walrus did beseech. A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk upon this briny beach we cannot do with more than 4 to give a hand to each. The oldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The oldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head as if to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat, and this was odd because, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4, and thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The walrus and the carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock conveniently low, and all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oysters said. Before we start our chat. for some of us are out of breath and all of us are fat. No problem, said the carpenter. They thanked him much for that. What we need, now, see, it happened. A loaf of bread, the walrus said, is what we chiefly need. Vinegar and pepper besides are very good indeed. Now, if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed. But not on us, the oyster said, turning a little blue. After such kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do. The air is fine, the walrus said. Do you admire the view? It seems a shame, he said, to play them such a trick, after we have brought them out so far and make them trot so quick. The carpenter said nothing but, the butter spread too thick. I weep for them, the walrus said. I deeply sympathize. With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. Oh, oysters, said the carpenter, you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again? But answer came there none, and this was scarcely odd because they'd eaten every one. A dark poem to end. Thank you. Thank you.